Hey again, we're back with the history of Saorsa in 3D. Oh, wait, I misread that. It's part 3. Huh, well, close enough. Anyway, so we've covered how Saorsa was more or less taken from the dragons after they basically waged war with, well, pretty much everyone. And nearly won. Because dragons don't do anything halfway. We also covered how it got repurposed into what may as well be a planetary penal colony / rehabilitation center. And then that the one in charge of managing a lot of the challenges went nuts with delusions of goddesshood. Just because she's basically a goddess. Funny how that happens. It's almost like there's some sort of connection there. But we didn't really cover the species that arrived on Saorsa. Well, we've covered them individually, but not really why they were chosen for Saorsa's rehab program. What goes into picking a species to make it available? Why are certain ones let in en masse, and others you only see one or two of scattered about? Well, let's try to do this roughly chronologically. First off, since it was the dragon homeworld, obviously there are dragons. To be fair though, the actual setup for rehabilitation is actually pretty similar to what dragons just do naturally anyway, so they didn't exactly mind the setup. Now, the whole omnivore thing basically boiled down to whether other species should be taught the ways of being worthy of being a dragon or not. So essentially, the yes they should instead of being exterminated like ants side obviously won. Even so, there's a bit of a split still. The main split now is whether everyone should be just given blanket treatment of trying to make them dragony-ish, or if it should be limited only to those individuals who show themselves worthy, and it's just a waste and somewhat insulting to try to bring everyone up to on par with dragon standards. So, the dragons are already present upon the world, and they kind of still have some issues to bicker over. Their factions are largely more about how to treat others than anything else, and really, that's not that surprising since dragons are pretty close to loners in the first place. Yeah, they'll work with a group if they have to, but they generally rather prove themselves capable of doing so alone. Really, let's face it, the main reason a dragon usually lets others near them is for an audience, so they have proof that they can do amazing stuff. So, who else showed up after the dragons? Well, the first actual species to arrive on Saorsa, other than the dragons and the Assyrians, were the Pharaohs. As you may recall, they're sort of vaguely close to Terran hyenas and share some fairly similar values with the dragons and the Assyrians already, so they were a natural fit for the Saorsa program. Not that they actually had a choice in the matter, but they didn't much mind at all. They adapted to Saorsa like wildfire and spread out across the world, many even choosing to stay after they could have gone home. The next major species to arrive were the Polaris a few years later. Again, the Polaris were fairly compatible with Saorsa's goals, and while they were a little miffed in general to be dragged there, since they viewed it as tampering with the vast tapestry of the Kismet, they begrudgingly admitted that, yes, there was sort of a purpose behind it, so they'll tolerate the transgression. Now, there were petitions by this point to include the cubi. These tiny demonic fae are usually not all that welcome much of anywhere because of their normal incompatibility with the basic laws and values wherever they tend to go. That wasn't deemed to be a good reason to include them within Saorsa immediately. The purpose of Saorsa is to essentially teach individuals who they are as a person and to prep them to make great changes in the worlds they go back to. Whether those changes are for good or ill, however, that's outside the scope of the project. The point is simply to make them fit for altering the course of history. When that was painfully explained, along with the fact that this world would make the cubi even more effective at being, well, cubi, those petitioners suddenly disappeared, and so they were postponed on their addition. The next major species to be added, the third in total since the cubi weren't added yet because of the aforementioned issues, were the humans. In particular, the humans from Terra itself, first and foremost. Over time, humans from other worlds were gradually allowed in, including demi-humans, those species like elves, orcs, dwarves, and so on. These demi-humans are offshoots of humans who are still genetically compatible with their originators from Terra proper, and though these subspecies may not think of themselves as human, to most other species they actually have difficulties telling the various branches of humanity apart. Humans come in plenty of shapes and sizes already as it is. Some grow to be over 6 feet tall, others are well under 5 feet on average. Some are brown or nearly black, some beige, others more reddish skin toned or yellowish in appearance. With such a variety as it is, how do you honestly explain to someone that green isn't a valid human coloration, or that orcs in general somehow aren't human enough to be human? Eventually it just came down to determining that if they're genetically compatible for breeding with humans, then they're human. It was just the only realistic way that such could be determined. And since things like half-elves or half-orcs exist, that kind of answered that question. Now, this led to the intentional addition of the demi-human species. What wasn't intentional was that human magi from Terra proper had already added a new species to Saorsa, the Kara. These Terran magi had been lacking access to the etheric energies needed to harness magic, and as soon as they were able to invoke such powers upon Saorsa, they were fraught with despair over the mismatch between what they had expected familiars to be capable of and what the reality of the situation was. And following the human tradition of always striving for more than they currently have, these magi artificially created the new species of Kara to do their bidding in a manner which mere familiars could never hope to achieve. And it was shortly after this that another surprise occurred. It was then discovered that the Nogitsune had been drawn to Saorsa inadvertently. These Vulpine illusionists were so well hidden that quite a few had been drawn to the world without even the knowledge of the Assyrians, having been drawn in under the guise of several other species. So natural of a fit were they, with their overwhelming desire to fit into whatever culture they came into contact with, that it was discovered a disproportionately large number of those who had completed the challenges of Saorsa were, in fact, Nogitsune, who had taken to the world with a nearly religious fervor. A few centuries passed without further additions. the cubi being brought up several times for potential of entry to Saorsa. After lengthy deliberations and a great deal of vocal protests, eventually even these diminutive creatures were introduced to the world proper. Over this short span of a few hundred years, however, a new species arose on the distant world of Nocturne. The Kayla not only leaped through the ages, from the Stone Age to the Bronze and the Iron, but indeed into the Nuclear Age at a rate unprecedented. Few species had even bothered to cast this weird moss-based species a first glance, much less a second, and yet one of their techmaturgists opened a portal directly to Saorsa and stepped right into the world of her own volition. An emergency session had to be held among the most high-ranking of the Assyrians, for this previously underdeveloped species had not only skipped ahead in their civilization many times faster than any previously known species, but their intense inquisitiveness and desire to explore forbidden knowledge had led to their being capable of breaching even the formidable barriers and wards placed around Saorsa proper. As it quickly became clear that keeping this infant species outside the borders of the world would be just short of impossible, instead, it was decided to embrace the inevitable and allow the Kayla entry into Saorsa. The Kayla don't tend to adhere to rules very well, so it was unfortunate that the rather vague setup of Saorsa was well suited to their methodology of exploration of most everything, now including themselves. With the players in attendance and the pieces set in place, the game was to begin, with the stakes being the legacy of the old gods. Regardless of the outcome of what would happen, the face of the universe would never again be the same. Anyway, that's a quick rundown of the species of Saorsa in the order which they arrived. There's not much more to say, or, well, technically speaking, there's a ton more to say, and I could have easily made this video many times longer than it actually was. But I'm trying to be brief here. Succeeding or not, you be the judge. Anyway, with that, I'm out. I'll see you next time.